Hello everybody, it's your Peacekeeper coming at you with the next video in our Is It Balanced series. In the last video we talked about battleships. I'll go ahead and throw a link to that down in the description. In this one we're covering destroyers. And, well, there's going to be a lot of salt on this. So, if you're one of those people who is in the camp of my Japanese destroyers are super underpowered, well, there's going to be some eye-opening stats here, and of course, one of the things that we need to talk about before we even begin, we'll go ahead and we'll cover the statistics themselves, which ones I feel are the important ones in this line, but before we talk about that, I want to cover this whole idea of the meta for all the destroyer lines. And from the very get-go, the U.S. destroyers get put into this ambush role, where they have workable guns, workable torpedoes, they're really good at popping out behind an island and ambushing whatever the heck is there and then getting the heck out of dodge. They've got great smoke to do sit and plink and sit and just light people on fire. They've got usable torpedoes. The Russians, they are pretty much discouraged from the get-go for ever using their torpedoes outside of being an ambush ship. However, their gun traverse actually limits them on their capabilities in a knife fight. And so as a result, they get that role of, well, you're a long-range plinker. And no more is that evident than at Tier 10, where the Cabbar is basically a light cruiser. And then, of course, the Japanese destroyers, well, they get kind of shoehorned very early on into this torpedo boat role. Don't detect me. Oh my god, I'm a ninja. If you see me, I'm dead. And the unfortunate part of that is people don't realize that as the Japanese destroyer line gets further down the road, the guns get better while the torpedoes stay very powerful and capable, but they have more disadvantages to them, which means you actually have to use the guns on them in order to take full advantage of the high-tier ships. And nowhere is that more evident than in the stats, and we'll cover that when we get there. But starting at Tier 7 with Hatsuharu, it starts to take that turn, because Hatsuharu has really workable guns. Sure, you lose one when you go to the B hole, but you get those other torpedoes, which, you know, there's a good debate there on which ones are the best, but really, across the line, I was actually quite shocked with how balanced these ships are. With that in mind, I also want to state that this is, today is November 4th, and we don't know when the Japanese destroyers the split is coming out, so this is all that change. So if you're watching this video sometime in the future and are looking at this for balance, you might want to find a more up-to-date video, but I would be shocked if Wargaming doesn't have those things out by the time we get around to this video again, because it's going to be several months before I get to doing these videos again, simply because I want to keep the data fresh, and there's going to be a number of changes, I'm sure, between now and then across the board, because Wargaming is constantly balancing ships. So, let's dive into the stats. Again, the three primary stats that I'm looking at are win rate, average damage, and average XP. Those three stats right there tell you a lot about how a ship plays. If a ship has really low average damage but has really high average XP and a high win rate, that tells you that they're contesting caps more often and that the damage they're doing is more oriented towards low health ships, like destroyers. You would think that would follow through with the U.S. destroyer line in a lot of places, and for the most part you would be correct. Contrast that with a ship that has a low win rate and a low average XP but has high damage. That tells me that they're using their torpedoes all the time and that they're focusing on big juicy targets like battleships. Cue the IJN DDs. That's pretty much their MO, right? Well, the goal here is to have these three stats balanced across the board. And the reason for that is if the win rate's the same, the average XP is the same, and the average damage is the same, in spite of the different play styles for these ships, that means that they're having the same basic impact across the board. Their average damages are comparable, which means that even though the Japanese are focusing on the shooting of battleships and taking them out of the game, they're not out damaging the ships that are contesting caps, or the Japanese destroyers aren't behind in XP because they're not contesting caps. All of those things would be equal across the board. Those secondary soft stats, like average plane kills, kill-to-death ratio, ship kills, main battery hit rate, and torpedo hits, survivability, all of those are stats that can be kind of messed around with based on the play style to accomplish having the same win rate, average damage, and average XP. Now, it's hard to really get all of these ships balanced because not everybody is playing the ships the same. Not everybody has the same skill level, and not everybody's playing all the ships. You know, I've played all 3 lines of these ships. Granted, I stopped at Tier 7 for the Russian destroyers, but I had a pretty good idea of how to play the Tier 8, 9, and 10, considering the line doesn't really change that much. And I really have to say that it's no more is it more evident than at Tier 8 when people start saying, well, Fubuki's stats are really bad, and, well, that's because she's underpowered. Well, I disagree with that. Fubuki is a very strong ship, but you have to play all of her strengths. You can't just play one of her strengths, which would be her torpedoes. They're very good torpedoes. She has 9 of them, and they come in 3 separate launchers, which means you can make some very hard-to-dodge spreads. But there are people that don't play with the guns at all, and that's really a shame because, like I said, Tier 7 and up, they get really good in the gunplay department. Even though they don't have the raw damage per minute, damage per second, however you wish to articulate that stat, they don't have the damage per minute and damage per second of, say, a US destroyer, but their guns are still very capable. They hit very hard, they have a high fire chance. Both of those things together really help them out in the damage department. It also helps them out, too, with the new economy with the average XP department, because if you're shooting at destroyers in the appropriate ranges, you can still get the average XP, and that's going to help your win rate, too. Well, let's go ahead and dive into the stats here, because I'm sure you're sick of me complaining about the meta. These stats were pulled November 2nd, 2016. They are 2-week stats, so they go back to October 19th, 2016. And starting with Tier 2, we got Samson, Umikaze, and Startsevoy. I'm sure that's said completely wrong, but it's the Russian DD at Tier 2. Okay, Umikaze is dominant. We'll just say it like that. It leads Samson, which is the next best ship in the line, at least in win rate anyway, by 4.1%. And it leads Startsevoy by 1.94% in win rate. Then we get to the damage number, 5,376 damage. That's quite a lot at Tier 2. And that's over the Startsevoy. It's 6k over the Samson. Average XP between the Samson and the Russian DD, I'm just going to call it the Russian DD from now on, is only 1. So those 2 ships are pretty comparable, at least in that regard. And their win rates are pretty comparable too, less than 1% difference. Average damage, 770. So really not that big of a difference between those 2 ships. However, Umikaze leads by 67 XP over the Russian DD and 68 over the Samson. That's a lot at Tier 2. That's really a lot. And so that leads a lot to the discussion that goes on all the way up till Tier 5 with Japanese destroyers and their performance levels. But let's go ahead and talk about Tier 3 now. At Tier 3, Wix and Wakatake are pretty dang close. In fact, pretty much all across the board, they're well within what I would call the noise of the tier. We're looking at 0.5% in terms of win rate, only 651 in damage, and only 8 in average XP. That's pretty dang well balanced. In fact, the only place that I would say that there really isn't any real balance there is Dertsky is kind of down in the win rate and average damage department, but average XP is fine. So that tells me that they're still contesting caps, but it's not enough for them to win, and they're not doing enough damage to actually be comparable to the other ships. But still, only 2,500 damage between the Dertsky and the Witz. Not a huge difference there. Really not. But average XP, 9 across all 3 tiers. 9 XP, that's it. That's pretty dang good. So Tier 3 is actually a pretty well-balanced tier. Tier 4. Well, we get right back to the argument with Japanese destroyers. Clemson and Isakaze, less than 1/10 of a percentage point in win rate, 6,600 damage between them, with Isakaze doing a lot more damage. Average XP, only 11. So really what that tells me is Clemson probably needs a damage buff, or people aren't playing Clemson to their fullest. That's always a possibility. Clemson is one of those destroyers that plays really well with the 15-point captain. You get concealment expert on there and advanced firing training. and that sucker has a huge stealth fire window. That's not something you see at Tier 4 unless you're down there seal clubbing, so that's probably a large portion of that difference. But Isakaze versus Iziaslav, 1,100 or 11,000 damage? 10,400 is what it ends up being. Or no. Yeah, 11,000. 11,000 damage between the two. And 3.17% in win rate between Clemson and Iziaslav. That's a really big difference. Average XP, though, not too bad. About 39.5. So, Tier 4, Iziaslav could probably use a bit of a buff in terms of damage. Maybe something to give him a little bit better win rate. Maybe some better survivability. Although it seems like, well, yeah, it could probably use a survivability buff. It looks like it's pretty far down there. Tier 5. Tier 5, well, this returns to that theme with the Minakaze leads by a really large margin. Win rate between Minakaze and Nevny, 3.82%. Minakaze to Nicholas, 4.22%. Whew. That's a huge difference. Average damage, Nevny to Minakaze. Minakaze leading by almost 10,000 damage at Tier 5. Leads Nicholas by 10,400. Wow, that's quite a lot. But average XP across the board is pretty comparable, 33 XP. That's not a bad split. So what that tells me is those ships are fighting over caps about the same, but the win rate, I think the Minakaze just purely outdamages both of the Nevny and the Nicholas to the point where it's influencing the battle that much. And a large part of that is Nicholas loses a turret, and it goes from the 5-inch 51s to the 5-inch 38s. You get a damage per minute increase, but you lose the ability to hit targets as easily at longer ranges. So Nicholas is in a really weird place, but overall, the difference between Nicholas and Nevny is really not that far. Less than 0.5% in win rate, 402 in average damage, and only 22 in XP. So those two ships are pretty well balanced. Minakaze needs a serious downward trend there. Needs a serious, I hesitate to use the word nerf, but it needs a downward movement in its stats. Specifically in damage, and it's a little too utilitarian. And Minakaze actually has pretty workable guns. And Tier 5 is where they start to kind of get weird, because once we get to Tier 6, it's in a weird place. So let's talk about Tier 6. Tier 6, the Mitsuki, the Tier 6 Japanese destroyer, is often considered one of the low points in the Japanese destroyer line. I've heard it called everything from Mitsuki to just whatever. Any bad name that you could think of, Mitsuki is probably the most common one. What's interesting about it is she's really not that far behind all the other ships. In fact, this is probably one of the more balanced tiers. Farragut to Ognivoy, win rate only 0.65%. Farragut to Mitsuki, a little bit more at 1.78. That's a little bit more than it should be, but once we start factoring in damage and XP, there's some split there. Farragut and Mitsuki only differ by 69 damage. That's pretty dang good. And Farragut to Ognivoy, like 225, roughly. So not a huge difference in damage done. That tells me that Mitsuki is at least capable of using her torpedoes, even if her gun configuration is less than ideal. Average XP, 100 and a quarter XP between Ognivoy and Mitsuki. Farragut to Mitsuki, only 40 XP. So that tells me that Ognivoy is really getting to the point where the Russian DD line is starting to push their, I don't want to say overpoweredness, but their strong suit way further than either of the other two ships are. This is also the tier where people, for some odd reason, forget they have guns. And that's probably because Mitsuki's guns are absolutely terrible. The final hull upgrade only has 2 guns, and they're not particularly useful. So that's probably where this whole trend where people go, well, we can't use our guns anymore on Japanese destroyers. Which is a real shame, because at Tier 7, Mahan starts to pick up with some pretty solid Hatsuharu picks up with some pretty solid gunplay, even if it's not the best at out damaging something with guns. In terms of win rate, Kiev to Mahan, 1.53%. Hatsuharu trails Mahan by just over half a percentage point. 2% between Kiev and Hatsuharu. Average damage, Kiev bests Mahan by 6,586. Hatsuharu trails Mahan by only 700-ish. That's not a huge difference between Mahan and Hatsuharu. It's a huge difference between Kiev and Mahan. Average XP, 64 between Kiev and Mahan, and 68.5 between Mahan and Hatsuharu. That's more than it probably should be. But again, if we dropped out the Russian destroyers out of this tier, the US-Japanese destroyer parity is pretty dang close. Not a huge difference in win rate, not a huge difference in damage. XP, like I said, this is the tier where I think people forget about the guns on Japanese destroyers, because with the new economy, you get better XP by damaging other destroyers and contesting caps. That's part of your role. Of course, Japanese destroyers have really bad turret traverse and really bad rate of fire, so a lot of people forget that, hey, I've got guns. Well, again, we'll talk about that more once we get to the end and I go over the overall observations. Tier 8. This is where a lot of people say that the US destroyer line just basically dominates the game. It does, in a lot of ways. Benson leads Fubuki by 2.25% in win rate, but only bests Fubuki in average damage by 593, and Benson only leads Fubuki in XP by 106. So there's more to the XP there, and again, I think it's because people jump to that C hole, which please don't. Dear God, stick to the B hole on Fubuki. It's worth having all 3 of your gun turrets there to have all 6 guns. And again, I think people are at that point where they're like, well, Japanese destroyer, if I get spotted, I'm dead. Well, that's not entirely true. Your guns still are useful. And I think that's where that average XP difference is coming in. But you can see in terms of damage, only 593. In fact, average damage across the board, the split is only about 1,600. That's really dang good for Tier 8, given the differences in playstyles between a Benson, Fubuki, and a Trash Kent. And Trash Kent's really not that far behind either. I mean, win rate, okay, yeah, there's a pretty solid difference between the Benson and the Trash Kent. I think that's just because the Benson is really that utilitarian. And this is the only tier where the US just absolutely dominates the tier. Tier 9. Fletcher is not the top ship at Tier 9. Contrary to popular belief, Udaloy actually is the better destroyer, at least on paper, in terms of stats. Leads win rate by a little less than 0.5%, not a huge difference there. Average damage, 4,340. That's more than it really should be. And average XP is only 26. So what that tells me is Udaloy and Fletcher play very well at the contesting cap and killing destroyers game. What it tells me is that the Udaloy does a lot more damage, mostly because it's long range, very fast, and the turret, the actual shell trajectory is very flat, which means it can play that long range, annoying, won't leave you alone HE spammer game that the Fletcher can't really play because of the shell arcs and the long lead times. It's possible with AFT and DE to get the Fletcher to be able to play that long-range gun game, but only up against battleships and cruisers who aren't paying attention. The Kagero is a consistent underperformer in this tier. She is the worst in everything except for main battery hit and torpedo hit rate. She has the highest torpedo hit rate, although across the board torpedo hit rates for all the destroyers are pretty comparable. In this case, there's only a 1% difference between the Fletcher and Kagero, and 3% between the Udaloy and Kagero. And truth be told, Trash Kent was the first Russian DD that could stealth fire torpedoes. Udaloy takes that a little bit further. So who knows how much of that plays into the torpedo hit rate. Going down to Tier 10, and this is where a lot of salt is probably going to come on. You can see that the Khabarovsk, in spite of the recent nerf to its reload and its distance, its actual shooting range, is still performing consistently better than the other 2 ships. Khabarovsk leads gearing by 1.3%, leads gearing in damage by 8,004 damage, but only leads in XP by 18. So again, that goes back to that idea of Khabarovsk and Gearing are both very capable ships at taking out other destroyers and contesting caps. Khabarovsk is a monster in the game, and there is no way in heck I'm going to play my Gearing and get in a freaking knife fight with a Khabarovsk. You will lose that fight 10 out of 10 times. That ship just puts out way too much damage for a Gearing to handle. And a Gearing is an incredibly strong ship. Do not get me wrong on this. Its damage output is comparable to battleships 3 tiers lower. So it's got quite the damage output capability, and arguably some of the best torpedoes in the game. 16.5 kilometer range, 1.4 kilometer detect, 67 knot speed. Very capable torpedoes straight out the bat. And with torpedo acceleration, they become even harder to avoid. There's 10 of them as well. So you're only losing 5 torpedoes at Shimakaze. Shimakaze, on the other hand, is the classic example where I think people are just really honestly underplaying the ship to its fullest. And this is the creme de la creme. Like I said at the very beginning of this, Japanese destroyers start off very torpedo focused with really bad guns, but as the tiers progress on, and this is true of all the destroyer lines though, they get more well-rounded. And the Shimakaze's guns are some of the most potent things in the game. They don't have the rate of fire of a Gearing or Khabarovsk, but they've got a massive stealth fire window with concealment expert and advanced firing training, a super high fire percent chance given their rate of fire, and the thing has 15 torpedoes on it. And if you opt for the 12K torpedoes, you can throw torpedo acceleration on there. You still have the 1.9 kilometer detection range on the torpedoes, but they're moving really quick, like 73 knots, I think. And they do a lot of damage, 23,000 damage. Man, those things hit like a truck. And the raw damage stats themselves don't tell the whole story there either. Really what that comes down to is you have to be honest with yourself. How many times do you realistically hit with the torpedo? Ignoring the torpedo hit rate entirely. In a good salvo where I don't miss entirely, I'm looking at 1 or 2 torpedoes. That's really about the extent of it. That's Shimakaze, that's Gearing, that's all the way back to Kiev, which has 4-kilometer torpedoes. I mean, missing with those is pretty hard, but I still don't find myself just absolutely dominating in a bunch of torpedo hits. But the Gearing's torpedoes, while they hit hard, do not hit nearly as hard as Shimakaze's torps do. And the Gearing has some of the worst gun arcs of any destroyer in the game. And that makes Gearing very difficult to play outside of that about 8-kilometer and in range, where the fast turret traverse and the high rate of fire just absolutely destroys anything except for Khabarovsk up close and personal. And that plays out really unfortunately for the aggressive Shimakaze player, because there's no real way for Shimakaze to get in there and contest caps in that kind of environment without a lot of support. But by the same token, when it comes to doing damage, a well-supported Shimakaze is almost impossible to get rid of, because the stealth fire window on those guns is so long. The high fire chance means cruisers at range, if you're wiggling and waggling as you're shooting those guns, especially because you got 4 barrels pointing out your back end, and it doesn't take much angle to get the front turret into play. Really, you use your speed to run away from whatever it is that's chasing you while you just burn it to the ground. And I have had tremendous success playing the Shimakaze in that style. In fact, I'm going to drag my stats over here. Now you can see I've not played Khabarovsk, so like I said, I stopped at tier 7 with the Russian destroyers. But I have 78 battles in a Gearing. My average damage is only 50,759. That's pretty good. That's well above the average, which this is tracking all-time stats. So the all-time stats for Gearing are way low because of the way there's been some changes to U.S. destroyers since the game launched. But Shimakaze, that's all been post-nerf. I didn't have Shimakaze until less than a month ago. So Shimakaze in 20 battles, I'm having over 10,000 damage more. Well, maybe not. Right around, we'll just say 10,000 damage more. Just right off the bat. And you can see that when it comes to torpedo hits, I'm below average on torpedo hits by 1%. So in 20 battles, I have a higher win rate, higher damage, higher XP, higher kill-to-death ratio, higher ship kill ratio, higher survivability, higher main battery hit rate than a gearing does. So what that tells me is that a lot of people are really underplaying Shimikaze's strengths. And the playstyle is not for everybody, I get that. And who knows what's going to happen to all these ships, all the Japanese destroyers, once this line change comes out. I'll have to do another video when that happens, because I'm sure it's a stark change compared to where they're at right now. Okay, so let's talk about the overall then. The Japanese destroyers lead, unquestionably, all the way up to Tier 5. After Tier 5, they start to fall off. And like I said, I think the reason for that is we get to Mitsuki and everybody just forgets that guns exist on the high-tier Japanese destroyers and try and play that ninja role where, oh, I got 10-kilometer torps, you never have to see me. Okay, you can play that way. You're underplaying the ship because you're not utilizing all of the ways that those ships can deal damage. And Hatsuharu's gun as a gun platform is still quite capable. Do not get me wrong, it's still quite capable. Having watched a well-played Hatsuharu play, it's very strong in that mid to long range gameplay, especially when it comes to doing just raw damage numbers. US destroyers are very utilitarian. They start off in that kind of ambush role, and then they go into just really well-rounded gunships with very usable torpedoes. I'm really curious to see how the other nations' destroyer lines fit into this roleplay, because if you look traditionally at German destroyers, they're very strong gunships, not really all that strong in the torpedo and depth charge department. It really wasn't their thing, even though German torpedoes were really good. So be curious to see how they fit in. I'll be curious to see how the British destroyers fit in, because they were more along the lines of escort ships, primarily doing convoy duty. It'll be interesting to see how all that stuff kind of works in, but really the only nation that was really torpedo focused was the Japanese Navy, and they start off super focused on torpedoes at the very beginning and become really more well-rounded with, they're like the antithesis to the Russian destroyers at the high tiers. They both have very usable long-range weaponry, but the Russian destroyers are focused on the gunnery aspect of it, whereas the Japanese are more oriented towards the torpedo aspect of it, but they both have very capable long-range guns, and they both have very capable torpedoes. It's just that the Japanese are more torpedo-focused, the Russians are more gun-focused. And to forget that guns exist on Japanese destroyers leaves all of your damage potential from them on the table. And yes, you can do a lot of damage with torpedoes in either ship and never fire a single round from your guns, but you're not getting the most out of those ships, if that makes sense. Also, to talk about win rates and torpedo hit rates, you know, the big torpedo hit nerf to the Japanese destroyers, everybody says is this terrible thing. I can't hit anything with the torpedoes. Fubuki and Benson are basically identical in torpedo hit rate, and everybody says that Benson's torpedoes are some of the strongest in the game, and I wouldn't disagree with that. You have one more torpedo than Fubuki on the get-go, but they're slower and they have a shorter detection range, so it kind of evens out. Hatsuharu to Mahan, a little bit different, still basically the same. In fact, let's scroll up here. Hatsuharu 7%, Mahan 6%. Not a huge difference there. And Kagero's torpedo hit rate is 1% more than Fletcher, and Shimikaze is only down 2% to gearing and torpedo hit rate. And I suspect a large portion of the reason why people don't hit as often with Shimikaze's torps is because they're using those godforsaken 20-kilometer torps with the 2.5-kilometer detection range and like 62-knot speed. Get rid of those things ASAP, guys. They're not useful. They were never useful for anything more than just long-range torpedo spam, and it really hurts the way that ship plays, because you can't play her to her strengths. The 12K torps, whether you run torpedo acceleration or not, are very, very versatile with an AFT and concealment expert captain, a 15-point captain with AFT and CE. That allows you a pretty healthy stealth fire window for the guns. That also includes range for your torpedoes. You also have 15 of them, so hitting's a little bit easier, but if you play at the max range of those torpedoes, even at 12K, you're going to miss with them. So, while there's a difference there, I don't think that's entirely due to the fact that the Gearing's torpedoes are very capable. I think that's more due to the play style and the default hull for Shimakaze having 20K torps with 2.5 kilometer detection range, which, ironically enough, my first 4 games in Shimakaze were all over 100,000 damage, with the average being like 120,000 with those godforsaken 20K torps. That's because I found myself hitting targets beyond what I was actually aiming at, and that usually all happened at the very beginning of the game, which is kind of funny because you're shooting at one ship and all of a sudden you take out a ship, 5 kilometers behind it, which, hey, torpedo hits are torpedo hits, but the other interesting thing is, in terms of anti-aircraft, they're all pretty comparable. They all suck in terms of AA capability. And the U.S. really doesn't have a strong lead at any tier except for Tier 9. At Tier 10, the difference in average plane kills, 0.88 to 0.8, is less than a tenth of an aircraft. It's really not a huge difference between the Gearing and Cabbar, given how powerful the 5-inch 38 dual-purpose mounts were on all of the U.S. destroyers. And given the fact that Gearing and Fletcher both have defensive fire without sacrificing a gun turret. Because you see Benson, Mahan, and Farragut all can drop in the Sea-Hole configuration a gun turret for more AA, but it's all medium range AA. So there's not really a huge trade-off there, but you do get defensive fire. I don't see many people taking them because you lose so much in offensive capability for that really limited use ability. Defensive fire to me is not something that belongs on a destroyer. It gets used only because I play with other people who want me to have it. And I don't know. I don't see it as being as useful as speed boost. I'd rather outsmart a carrier, and if I can't outsmart him, then defensive fire isn't going to help me. Because if he doesn't kill me that time around, he's going to kill me the next time he comes around. So a good carrier captain's going to negate defensive fire. Heck, he'll even bait it out of you. So defensive fire is not that strong as some people would like you to believe. So anyway, this has been my comparison. Yes, there are some Japanese destroyers that could use some love. There's also some that could use some serious attention and downward moving of their stats. Because the Tier 2, Tier 4, and Tier 5 all have very, very, very strong gameplay. Tier 3 is pretty close. But Tier 2, 4, and 5 are very strong and capable ships. They are no slouches by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, I'm sure all this is going to change, and we'll have to do a video after the line split, and it'll probably be several months before I get to that, because we got to do cruisers and carriers still. Cruisers are going to take forever, because there's so many nations that have cruisers right now. I also want to give the Royal Navy cruisers the opportunity to their stats to stabilize some. So, cruisers might be the last ones I do. Carriers will probably be next. Unfortunately. I hate talking about carriers because I don't play them at all anymore. So, anyway, I'm your Peacekeeper. Like, comment, subscribe, and as usual, thanks guys for watching.